Hello, I'm Montse Alvarado. EWTN News In Depth is next.
Religious discrimination is religious discrimination, and unless it can survive strict scrutiny, it is unconstitutional.
Should students be banned from aid programs because they choose to attend religious schools? That's the question in a potentially landmark case argued this week at the Supreme Court. We'll take a deep dive. And carve-outs for religious schools in the Biden administration's Build Back Better program. The pushback from Catholic school leaders whose schools would not get funding for childcare or pre-K programs.
My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you far away from me?
The plight of thousands of migrants stuck in no man's land in Cyprus and Greece. These two didn't know it yet, but Pope Francis was about to come to their rescue. And living the feminist dream, new ideas for women through a Christian lens. EWTN News In Depth starts now.
Welcome to EWTN News In Depth. For the second time in 2 weeks at the Supreme Court, a major case of interest to you, our Catholic audience. The Mississippi abortion case last week that could reverse abortion law as we know it in the United States. And this past Wednesday, a case called Carson versus Makin, which revolves around school choice and whether religious schools should receive government funding. Reporter Mark Irons explains what's at stake.
God save the United States and this honorable court.
The Supreme Court examines a case, Carson versus Makin, that could have major implications for religious freedom and school choice. In Maine, a vastly rural state, not all public school districts have secondary schools. So the state offers tuition assistance to parents, allowing their children to attend private schools. But there are requirements. Maine says it must be a non-sectarian school in accordance with the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. That is now being challenged at the High Court.
Maine's sectarian exclusion discriminates based on religion. Like all discrimination based on religion, it should be subjected to strict scrutiny and held unconstitutional.
During oral argument Wednesday, Michael Bendez, an attorney arguing on behalf of two families from Maine, says the court should follow precedent set in previous cases, including one last year when the court ruled public education funds in Montana could go to private schools. Writing the majority opinion, Chief Justice John Roberts said then, a state need not subsidize private education, but once a state decides to do so, it cannot disqualify some private schools solely because they are religious. The state of Maine argues their case is different.
The state is allowed to use its pocketbook to promote the values that it has decided it wants to promote. And so this is a spending program, and what Maine wants to advance is religious neutrality. We want schools to be neither for nor against any particular religion.
Christopher Taub, Maine's Chief Deputy Attorney General, says the tuition restriction doesn't apply to schools that have a religious status, only those where religious values are instilled. But the Institute for Justice, the law firm representing the parents in this case, is questioning that line of distinction.
You have to look at the underlying motivation here. Why would they try to draw this line? They're drawing this line to exclude religious schools. And they're hostile to religion in this context.
Supreme Court justices weighed in Wednesday. Turning attention away from the state, Justice Elena Kagan was critical of some of the Christian schools referenced in the case, saying their school policies discriminate against homosexuals.
I mean, these schools are overtly discriminatory. They're proudly discriminatory. Other people won't understand why in the world their taxpayer dollars are going to discriminatory schools.
Justice Samuel Alito questioning why Maine prevents tuition assistance from going to religious schools now, when for decades that wasn't the case.
Maine didn't rule out these schools until, for many, many years, the parents were permitted to send their children to those schools.
And we spoke to Alana Stevenson, a Catholic school principal in Maine, who has had to turn away some students because Maine's program will not assist them.
Occasionally we have parents who just can't afford the tuition dollars and the agreements that we need on our end. So, it's a hard conversation to have.
Mark Irons, EWTN News In Depth.
We're joined by two experts to discuss the implications of this case from the perspective of parental rights and religious freedom law. Nicole Neely, president of Parents Defending Education, and attorney Andrea Paciotti-Bayer, director of the Conscience Project. Ladies, thank you for joining us. Andrea, oral argument on Wednesday was full of discussion about status use distinctions. Let's listen to Chief Justice Roberts' comments on that.
Well, and one religion says that's what they do with education, and the other religion says, no, we use it to propagate the faith. So it is the beliefs of the two religions that determines whether or not their schools are going to get the funds or not. And we have said that that is the most basic violation of the First Amendment religion clauses, for the government to draw distinctions between religions based on their doctrine.
Can you explain the status use distinction for our audience?
You know, Montse, it's very interesting. Prior to the oral argument, I thought I understood the status use distinction as being a distinction without much of a difference. And this was an issue that the government in Maine was trying to point out. They weren't discriminating against schools because they were religious. They were choosing not to involve schools because of the use of religion or the role of religion in their education. But as I was listening to argument on Wednesday, it really seemed like Chief Justice Roberts and the other justices were looking at this more from a traditional discrimination lens, that they were choosing to allow education, if it was private, to come in if it had no trace of religion to it, and discriminate against religious schools where religion was going to be woven through the education. So it started off being, I wonder if this is going to be a distinction without a difference, to really centering us back to the critical issue of, is religion being discriminated against in this school program? And I think at least 6 of the justices said, yes, it is, and that's unconstitutional.
Well, we're going to get to your predictions on this case in a moment, but Nicole, let's talk about your role defending parental rights in education. Why is this case and this issue so significant to you?
Sure. This case is fascinating because we have seen over the past 2 years, as children have been stuck at home doing Zoom school, parents have been horrified about the kinds of things that their children are learning because suddenly classrooms were in people's living rooms. So they were disappointed in what was being taught, what wasn't being taught, learning loss not being addressed. The war on merit, gifted programs being phased out. And I think overall, people have realized how disenfranchised they are by the school system. And again, I mean, this is being done to our children with our tax dollars in our name. And so the fact remains that once people know what is going on in their public school system, they want an out. And often case, those that where they want to go to are, their parochial schools, their religious schools. And so school choice is such an essential component of addressing the rot in our school system. And so, yesterday's case or argument was really important, and we're going to be watching it closely.
That's very interesting. We'll get to that a little bit more in a second. Andrea, there were also some discussions around government speech and claims that allowing the money to follow the student wherever they choose to go amounts to the government taking a position on religion. Why is that relevant here?
It's very interesting. We do have part of our First Amendment, a prohibition on the government establishing a religion. And there are some opponents to school choice. And in this case, they're saying Maine is basically guarding against the government creating a religion. Well, what came out of the argument is, in Maine's case, there's actually more involvement by the government in reviewing curriculum of religious schools and in entangling itself into it than it will if you just allow parents to make a free choice to the school that best fits their children. So it seems like it's a bit of a red herring to claim that the Maine school sectarian rule is a way to guard against an establishment clause problem or an establishment issue. And instead, what they've set up is one that gets the government looking into textbooks, looking into proposed curriculum. That's the kind of problem that we want to avoid. And allowing parents to choose and basically enabling that choice is a way that we avoid any kind of establishment issues in the first place.
Nicole, there was a back and forth between Justice Alito and Mr. Taub, the lawyer representing the state of Maine, that begs 2 questions. Let's listen first.
Suppose parents want to send their child using this money to an elite private school, Exeter, Andover, Miss Porter's. That would be okay, right?
Yes, those schools would likely be approved.
And they would provide the equivalent of a rough equivalent of a public education?
Yes, they would.
They would?
Yes. The defining feature of a public education is that it's religiously neutral. Now, you could go to Andover.
When you say a public education, all you mean is a secular education. That's what you mean.
That is the defining feature.
Why do the choices for parents and students have to be limited to non-religious schools? Was it surprising that very expensive elite schools were okay, but a parochial school would have been out of the question? Nikki.
Well, it turns out that it's choice for me, but not for thee, right? I mean, who are the kinds of children who want to get out of failing public schools? They're poor children, right? And these, the kinds of schools that these, elite think it's okay to send their children to, Exeter, Andover. I mean, it doesn't make, families at the end of the day want to choose the school that best fits their need, be it religious, be it gifted, be it special needs. And often, those cases or those opportunities come up in religious schools. And so for the government, for the state to draw this distinction between who can and can't get the money, to me, it's confusing and it's disappointing. And it really shows that, that they want to make decisions for us, and they don't want families involved in that process whatsoever.
The second question is for you, Andrea. Mr. Taub insisted various times in argument that the defining feature of public education is that it's secular. Why did he insist on that, and is he correct?
Well, I think it's curious. I think he insists on that because that serves his argument. It's something that all parents in Maine and all parents across the country should stand up and say, what? That's the defining feature of a public education. It's not academic rigor. It's not instilling a sense of citizenship or developing job skills or preparing for higher education, but religion neutrality. And I think that's really where we see a disconnect and maybe a movement among progressive secularists to take over public education, stripping it of its religious foundation, but not being concerned about what's left.
And you said something really important right now. It's religious foundation. The original schools, as we know them, were Protestant schools. They did take a position on religion at the moment that just after our Constitution was created, and state-level constitutions were created too. And we saw anti-Catholic bias there as well. Did we hear any of that in argument?
It's interesting, hearkening back to the Blaine amendments of the late 1800s. This case isn't about a Blaine amendment, but it's kind of like Blaine 2.0. Instead of being anti-Catholic, these programs, and Maine's program is anti-religion. Its sectarian rule excludes religion from the educational background or horizon for children. And that's something that most parents know is part of their family, especially people of faith. It's part of their family's culture, and they want that to be something not just limited to a Sunday school experience.
Right. Nicole, we watched the Virginia elections this year and various moves around the country to focus on school board elections as well. How is this week's case related to that effort, and is there anything that we glean from it that'll be useful to you?
Sure. I love Andrea's point about, where values are and people not wanting that to be restricted just to Sundays, because I think that's an essential element of a lot of the unhappiness we've seen from families. We see schools now sort of in an adversarial position against a lot of families. Teachers feeling it's their mission to deprogram children from the values that they learn at home. We see teachers with their TikTok saying, you can't keep an eye on me for 8 hours during the day. And people are horrified by that. They expect their children to go to school to learn to read, to write, but not to learn all, social engineering and social justice. We have seen astonishing learning loss over the past several years, which parents are deeply, deeply concerned about. Yet schools are spending finite time and money buying divisive books and talking about issues that families would rather discuss at home in a family setting on their time.
Andrea, can you predict for us what the outcome of this case will be when we can expect a decision?
I wish I could be 100% accurate in my predictions, but I think I'm getting close. After hearing oral argument, I believe it's going to be a win for the parents in Maine, and it hopefully will not be limited to just the Maine program, but really open doors for more creativity across the country. This is a big case. It's a really big case in a term where there are lots of big cases. So we probably will hear the court's decision at the end of the term, which happens to coincide with at the end of the school year in June. It could come before then. And what I do think we should encourage all of our state lawmakers to get ready and start putting on the books more options so that parents have greater mobility And that's actually going to be healthy competitions for our public schools as well.
Well, we'll be watching both of you, and we look forward to having you back to discuss the decision in the spring or the summer. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Montse.
Next, more funding issues regarding religious schools. A look at what the Build Back Better program will or will not do for Catholic schools as it promotes childcare and pre-K. A leading voice in Catholic education joins us with his concerns next.
I am here to see your faces and look into your eyes. Eyes full of fear and expectancy. Eyes that have seen violence and poverty. Eyes streaked by too many tears.
And later, a look at the Pope's trip to Greece and Cyprus, the way station for thousands of refugees fleeing war and oppression in Africa and the Middle East. His stern message to the nations who could take them in, but are not. And this week marked the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. We go to Lourdes, France to see how the Virgin Mary was celebrated. EWTN News In Depth will be back in a moment.
Welcome back to EWTN News In Depth. As we continue to look at religious liberty concerns at the Supreme Court, we look ahead to similar concerns on Capitol Hill. The Biden administration's Build Back Better plan is coming under scrutiny because of a clause in the act prohibiting religious organizations from making use of the bill's funding. The $1.7 trillion bill sets aside some $400 billion for expansions for childcare and new universal pre-kindergarten, but religious facilities like Catholic schools are blocked from the funding. It's an issue Senate Republicans held a roundtable about at the start of this month, and the superintendent of schools for the Archdiocese of Boston was invited to speak.
It's putting religious institutions in a position in which, if they want to get the money or to accept money that goes to parents, they have to enter a Faustian bargain in which they agree to basically give up their faith. The Catholic Church, we have 2,000 years of church teaching. We're not giving it up to get federal money for childcare or pre-K.
Superintendent Carroll joins us now from Boston to tell us more. Thank you for providing insight on this bill. Tom, how did you first discover these provisions, and how do they affect you and your schools in Boston?
Yeah, I found out from the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops, kind of gave us a heads up that the provision was in there. And I share the goal of expanding preschool. My wife is actually used to be a preschool teacher, and having expanded healthcare. Here in Massachusetts, 75% of the available parents in households across the state are working. And so there's a lot of interest in expanding access. Here in Massachusetts, we've had a program for some time. And it's completely neutral on religion. So we have public providers, we have private providers, religious providers, and we still don't have enough capacity to serve everybody. The mistake that the people are making that slipped this provision in, that basically is forcing religious institutions to walk away from these programs, is we need all hands on deck. We need a set of pluralistic options and let parents decide what kind of education they want. There are two things that parents decisions they make that are very intimate and personal. That's healthcare on one part. They want to go to the doctor that they're used to going to. But when they decide on where their child is going during the day, whether it's childcare or preschool or regular school, it's a very personal decision about finding a place that reflects their values and their faith, depending on what their circumstance is. And this bill doesn't allow it. On one hand, it has language saying all people can participate, including religious institutions. But the price of participation is that we essentially have to give up our faith to participate. We're just simply not going to take,
Give me some examples of that.
Under the guise, sure. So under the guise of anti-discrimination language, it basically says, for example, we can't discriminate based on religion. Well, we obviously, and I use this, the word has a pejorative sense, but obviously you have to be Catholic to be a Catholic priest. We also believe you have to be a practicing Catholic to be a principal of a Catholic school, to teach religion in a Catholic school. And we hire non-Catholics for other positions, but for those positions, we feel very strongly about that. The primary goal of our schools is to evangelize children. So it's important that we have people who share our faith in those key positions. That would not be allowed under the bill. The bill also, because it subjects us to Title IX, which bans discrimination based on gender, which sounds fine. And we obviously don't discriminate in the sense that most people think of that word. But we do have schools that are all boys schools and all girls schools. So if any of those schools are elementary schools that include a preschool position, by not having the standard religious exemptions that all these education laws have had for the last 3 decades under both parties, as the presidency flip-flops and the Senate and the House flip-flop back and forth over the last 3 decades, there's been a bipartisan consensus to carve out these exemptions. So we think it's really important to have religious providers included. Roughly 52% of all the seats in the country are provided for childcare and pre-K are provided by religious institutions because that's what parents are looking for in many cases, particularly in urban centers where we have very deep roots. The Catholic Church doesn't just do pre-K. We do immigration services, homeless services, the whole continuum of services in the community. We are deeply embedded in the communities in which we're located. And that gives us knowledge and access to people who we need services. And so you shouldn't be pushing people like that out of the way in a zeal to end up with a program that at the end of the day, if they don't fix this, it's going to be a purely public program with no religious participation. Now, I know there are some people that would be gleeful if that happened, and there's some ideologues that are going around lobbying in that direction, but that's not what parents are looking for. Parents are looking for options. These parents, I don't know their children. They know their children. They are the ones who should be making the decision on what kind of childcare and what kind of preschool environment their children are in and what kind of virtues they want passed on and what kind of faith they want passed on. That's right. So it should be a bureaucrat in Washington. It shouldn't be me. It shouldn't be, a bunch of elected officials in D.C. either. So I think they need to amend the bill to allow participation of religious institutions on the same neutral basis that we've had all along for 3 decades. And people think of the First Amendment, as you know, they think of free speech and freedom of the press. But embedded in the First Amendment is one of the cardinal priorities of the founding of this country is free exercise of religion. And this bill runs counter to that because the price of participation in preschool and childcare, if this goes through, written the way it is freedom of the religion for the parents who want to have their child educated, reflecting their own values, is going to go thrown right out the window. And a broader goal of expanding access to preschool, which is very important in childcare, is also going to go out the window. Because when you knock out half of the people that are providing the seats in the country, you're not expanding access, you're contracting it.
And you're not going to let people go back to work, of course. Part of the coalition letter that was sent by a group of religious leaders that you just noted this statistic from the Bipartisan Policy Center that 53% of Americans choose religious or faith-based childcare options. You were talking about that. How is this so significant coming back from the pandemic? Religious people want to build back too.
Sure. So we've actually had an incredible run in the last 18 months. Since July of 2020, our enrollment, after 50 years of decline in enrollment, our enrollment went up by almost 6,000 people. So there's a thirst out there in the wake of the pandemic for a variety of reasons of people want to get into religious schools, and it's bringing people back to faith in many respects. But I frankly, personally, I don't, it's a funny thing to say as a Catholic school superintendent, but I don't care whether they pick our schools or somebody else's schools. I just think parents should have, I'm a supporter of school choice. I think there should be lots of choices, let 1,000 flowers bloom. Let the parents sort out what's best for their own children. I'm not in favor of kind of bossing or forcing people into one type of school or another, even if it's a school that I happen to run. So what they're doing is taking a whole set of options that are very popular with parents, that have a disproportionate footprint in the child care and early childhood education space, and they're putting in conditions, basically us giving up our faith, that are going to make it impossible for us to participate. So that we don't want that to happen, but it's not just because of us. It's because of the parents involved and the children involved.
That's right.
And the people who should decide how children are educated in the country are the parents.
Well,
and
we're very supportive of that, Tom, and we know
shortchanged here.
That's right, they are, and we know that you came to Capitol Hill to make that clear, and we'll be looking out for this for you. Thank you so much, Tom.
Thank you for the opportunity to make more people know about this.
That's right.
It's just stuck here. No front, no back. It's not easy.
Voices of despair, what life is like for migrants in refugee camp limbo. But this woman's plea for help was about to be answered. That story next. And then a woman's sense of herself, a new kind of feminism from a Catholic perspective.
What I see, he who comes asking for freedom, bread, help, fraternity, and joy, who is fleeing hatred, finds himself in front of a hatred which is called barbed wire.
Focusing on refugees, Pope Francis is now home from his 5-day trip to Cyprus and Greece, where he called the migrant crisis a shipwreck of civilization. The Pope greeted refugees several times during his trip, including at a prayer service in Cyprus. He later toured a migrant camp on the island of Lesbos, Greece. Thousands of refugees from Africa and the Middle East are in limbo in Greece and Cyprus, unable to move on to further destinations. Pope Francis denounced European indifference to their plight and said countries have a moral obligation to accept those fleeing war, hatred, and oppression. In a sign of solidarity with those European countries that have accepted large numbers of refugees, Pope Francis and the Holy See have arranged for the relocation of up to 50 migrants to Italy. In Cyprus, EWTN News In Depth found 2 of them who did not yet know they would be among the lucky ones. Our colleague Rachel Lanz has their story.
My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you far away from me?
We don't have freedom of movement. You don't get to do things that you wish to do. So we miss all those moments. You're just stuck here. No front, no back. It's not easy.
Grace and Daniel fled Cameroon this May. They met after paying the same smuggler to help them across the border in Cyprus, where they hoped to find asylum in the European Union. The smuggler showed them an illegal way to cross the border by jumping over the fence.
I just had to close my eyes and God, please take control. I just felt. That was how I jumped. Then the sumo shot.
Yeah, I was afraid. I was scared.
The UN peacekeeping soldiers caught them quickly and brought them over to the border forces.
He had some bruises too. It was a terrible moment.
But neither the north nor south side wanted to accept them. And this is how they remained in no man's land, living in a tent for over 6 months.
Yeah, now it's cold.
It's cold.
Very cold. And that's where we take a shower. You can see it's closed now. It's closed. This is the buffet zone. They call it buffet zone. So here, it's meant just for the UN workers. Yeah, and maybe thanks to the restaurant, people can come. Yeah. So this is where we are stuck. We are not we can't move further. We cannot. We just walk around the premises. That's all.
Daniel is 20 and Grace is 24. Both hope to continue their university studies once they receive asylum in Europe. In the meantime, they entrust their situation to God.
Of course, we believe in God. So at least that's what has been keeping us strong, because our faith, we believe that they said in any circumstances that you find yourself, never give up in life. Yeah. So that saying has been keeping us strong, and I believe too. Believe God can do something.
It has not been easy. It has not been easy.
Person that can help us, we are okay with it. We really need help. Stuck in here for 6 months, it's not 6 days, it's not 6 weeks. It's not easy.
On December 3rd, the Vatican confirmed that approximately 50 migrants will be transferred from Cyprus to Italy thanks to Pope Francis's mediation, Vatican financial support, and the Rome-based Sant'Egidio community.
Laundry.
Daniel and Grace are among the first 12 migrants who will travel to Italy before Christmas. In Rome, Rachel Lands for EWTN News In Depth.
Just days after EWTN News In Depth shot this interview, Daniel and Grace found out about their selection to go to Italy. By text message, Daniel told EWTN producer Alexei Gotovsky that the Pope had heard their cry. He said it was a miracle, and he and Grace were blessed. He gave all thanks to God and Pope Francis. On the flight back from Greece, Pope Francis made additional news, announcing he planned a second meeting soon with Russian Orthodox Patriarch Kirill in his effort to strive for unity between the Catholic and Orthodox churches. Their historic first encounter came in 2016 in Cuba. That meeting was the first time a pope met with the head of the Russian Orthodox Church in almost 1,000 years, when the two churches split in what's called the Great Schism. Coming up, we continue the discussion about the dignity of the human person as we remember the anniversary of the Vatican's Declaration on Religious Freedom. Expert thought on that. Plus, top headlines in the Weekend Review. We'll be right back. News of a diplomatic boycott tops the Weekend Review. EWTN News In Depth has reported many times on the human rights abuses in China, including those against religious minorities. Because of those abuses, the U.S. will not send diplomats or other representatives to next year's Winter Olympics in Beijing. However, this will not impact the participation of American athletes. Team USA will have the Biden administration's full support.
What we announced today is that we will not send any diplomatic or official representation to the 2022 Winter Olympics in Beijing and the Paralympic Games, given the PRC's ongoing genocide and crimes against humanity in Xinjiang, as well as other human rights abuses.
China responded to the announcement with a barrage of criticism. The Foreign Ministry office said Washington would, quote, pay a price for its wrong behavior. Other Western countries have announced they are also joining the diplomatic ban, including Britain and Australia. One of our nation's most visible members of the greatest generation has passed away at the age of 98. Former Senator Bob Dole of Kansas served in Congress for 36 years and was the Republican nominee for president in 1996, losing to incumbent President Bill Clinton. Dole was one of our country's most influential legislators on Capitol Hill. A master at forging compromise, he became Senate Republican leader and worked across the aisle to pass legislation that left our country better off, including the Americans with Disabilities Act, farm and nutrition programs, and Social Security reform. As an Army lieutenant during World War II, he nearly lost his life on the battlefield in Italy when an explosion severely damaged his shoulder and spinal cord. He was in the hospital nearly 3 years and never regained the use of his right hand and arm. Always a cheerleader for his fellow veterans, he was instrumental in getting the World War II memorial built on the National Mall. Well into his 90s, he was a fixture there on Sundays, an unofficial greeter welcoming other World War II vets who came to visit the memorial. President Joe Biden and First Lady Jill Biden paid tribute to Dole when they visited the World War II Memorial on Tuesday to mark the 80th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor. They laid a wreath to honor those who lost their lives. It contained a wild sunflower, the state flower of Kansas, in remembrance of Dole. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, was a defining moment that led to the U.S. entry into World War II.
In gallantry.
They are dwindling in number, but about 30 survivors of Pearl Harbor gathered at the site of the Japanese bombing to remember those killed in the attack. The oldest veteran in attendance was 101 years old. More than 2,300 U.S. servicemen died in the bombing. Nearly half were Marines and sailors serving on the USS Arizona, a battleship moored in the harbor. This year's ceremony took place as a strong storm packing high winds and heavy rains hit Hawaii. Prayers are slowly being answered in Haiti as 3 more missionaries have been released by their captors. A violent gang kidnapped 17 hostages, including children from U.S.-based Christian Aid Ministries in October. 2 hostages were released last month. The 3 this week included a mother and her child. Christian Aid Ministries said they're in good spirits, but reiterated a request for prayers for the 12 still held against their will. This week is the 57th anniversary of Dignitatis Humanae, the Second Vatican Council's Declaration on Religious Freedom. Dignitatis Humanae spells out the Church's teaching on religious liberty as a social and civil right for individuals and communities. The Council of Bishops declared that the right to religious freedom has its foundation in the very dignity of the human person. The declaration also states that religious freedom should be recognized by laws and governments so all can find and worship God free from government coercion. Dr. Matthew Bunson, EWTN News Executive Editor and Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief, joins us now to discuss this revolutionary text. It's great to have you here. Why was it necessary to clarify church teaching 56 years ago? What was going on?
Well, there were a couple things that the Council Fathers at the Second Vatican Council considered to be really important in this document, in this statement. The first was the recognition that we'd had several centuries of really severe abuses of human rights, the dignity of the human person. But it was also in keeping with the Second Vatican Council's call to have a dialogue with the modern world. And part of it was the terrible experience of the 20th century taught us that the threats are there, the threats remained to human dignity. And in that sense, then, this document not only was timely when it was promulgated, but it has proven especially prophetic for all of us today in this new century.
And what does the document actually say about religious freedom?
Well, it starts at the very beginning. In fact, the title of the document, Dignitatis Humanae, human dignity, it anchors everything in the Church's, one of the key foundational teachings of Catholic social teaching, and that is on the dignity of the human person and the inviolability of the rights of that person. And that extends to the freedom of belief, the freedom of religion and worship. And one of the things that the document uses is a key phrase there. It talks about that all persons must be immune from coercion. In other words, they should be free from having their religious liberties infringed upon, but they also should have the freedom to choose their religion. It's something of a revolutionary document, but we also have to stress that the other thing that this document does is to reiterate clear, classic, traditional church teaching that this is the true church, but it also recognizes the inviolability of the rights of the individual in society, and especially civil society, to have that religious freedom.
That's right, to be guaranteed. Matthew, there's a duality there in that document. There's the religious freedom that's very important. It's a human right. And then there's also reiterating that laws are there and they do exist and we have to follow them. How do we strike that balance?
Well, the balance is struck by, again, reiterating what we believe as Catholics, and that is the dignity of the human person. We keep coming back to that in this document. But then it's also that if we're going to have freedom of worship, we have to have that freedom within society. This document was prophetic in the sense that here we are in two different ways. We have atheistic communism, we have atheistic relativism that is impinging on the rights of believers, but then we also have around the world real threats to the dignity of the human person and the freedom of worship, religious freedom, from those who would impose certain religious beliefs on others. So it's a clarion call within this document, and for finding that balance then for Catholics is to live the faith, but then also to defend the right to live the faith.
And so then with the secularism rising, how were Catholics called to live this out?
Well, the first is to follow very closely what the Council called and what this document calls, and that is to fearlessly proclaim the teachings of the Church, but then to be aware, as we all need to be, of the threats that exist to religious freedom, to religious worship. And that means being aware of the constitutional threats, the cultural threats, but also to keep in mind especially our sisters and brothers around the world who, by the hundreds of millions, are facing limitations and threats to their religious freedom and their rights to worship freely.
A global document for a global moment. Thank you so much, Matthew.
Good to be with you.
Wrongly accused, he spent more than a year behind bars, much of that time in solitary confinement. Next week on EWTN News In Depth, Cardinal George Pell will join us on the record to discuss what it was like being accused, convicted, and then acquitted of child sex abuse. He shares how he kept the faith through it all.
Why am I still a Catholic?
because I'm still a believer. I believe in Christ. I believe that the closest thing to the body of Christ is the Catholic Church, led by the Pope and the bishops. I believe that. I know a bit of church history. I'm well aware there have been much sinfulness, many crimes committed, but they're far outweighed by the goodness and beauty and the faith of 1 billion, 300 or 400 million Catholics throughout the world.
His faith in Christ, his fortitude and perseverance. Our on-the-record interview with Cardinal Pell next week. This week, we celebrated the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, a day to honor the way in which the Blessed Mother herself was conceived. As our church teaches, the Virgin Mary was from the moment of her conception preserved immune from all stain of original sin, the perfect vessel to carry our Savior. In Lourdes, France, at the Basilica of the Immaculate Conception, Our Lady was honored throughout the day on Wednesday with a Mass, floral tribute, music, rosary, and Eucharistic adoration. Huge crowds gathered to take part, even in the cold rain. The site is where our Blessed Mother revealed in visions to Saint Bernadette her name, telling her, "I am the Immaculate Conception, Ave Maria." Our discussion about Christian feminism is next.
And then, visitors flock to the annual exhibit of the 100 nativity scenes in St. Peter's Square, made out of everything from shells to chocolate to watch parts. We'll show you this year's version of the creative display that's been drawing crowds for decades.
Last week, we brought you in-depth coverage of the historic oral argument at the Supreme Court on abortion. Both pro-abortion and pro-life cries were heard in rallies outside the court. A common thread: feminism. Some believe in order to support women and/or feminism, one must support a right to abortion. But many on the pro-life side would say that true feminism is allowing a woman to carry her pregnancy to term and honoring all life. The definition of feminism has changed over the decades, with various waves of the movement challenging the role of women in the workplace, home, and society. The church, however, is clear. Women are created in the image and likeness of God, equal but unique from men. Writer Kate Bryan has done a deep dive into the subject of femininity. She's the author of Living the Feminist Dream, a faithful vision for women in the church and the world. She shares her own faith journey with us this week and joins us now from Miami, Florida. Kate, it's so great to be with you today.
Montse, thank you so much for having me on the show.
Absolutely. It's great to have you. Your book is this roadmap for redefining feminism, but also rediscovering femininity. And you bring in examples from women of faith who are secular and also women from the church. Tell us about this purposeful feminism that embraces God's plan.
It really is a roadmap even of my own life, Montse. And I think any woman, whether in the church or in the world, we all have our own journeys, and our journeys, each of our journeys are so important. And so that's really what I wanted to convey through this book. And it was my own journey as a single woman living in the church, a single woman living in the world, and different experiences that I had where I saw faux feminism, if you want to call it that, faux feminism played out in our culture, in our world. And I really wanted to grasp that as an individual woman and make it my own. And I think that is so many women in the world, so many women in the church, that we have that power to grasp it and make it our own and really redefine feminism.
Absolutely. And I know you discuss this in your book as well, but give us a preview. How did your journey in the church start? Were you always a woman of faith?
I was born, my mom always talked about, Montse, that I was born with this little spark of faith. Some people, right, they find their faith life later on in life. And for me, I was a little kid and I would walk to Mass if my parents weren't going. I would always pray the rosary. I'd walk around with little rosaries as a 4 or 5-year-old little kid. And so my mom always talked about how I was born with this little spark of faith. And then it was almost like pulling a thread. Little by little, as I got older, I went to Franciscan University of Steubenville and studied theology because I was really interested in my faith life. And then my faith just has continued to grow. My relationship with the Blessed Mother has continued to grow. And I just think it's so important that we're constantly evolving. And that's what I really wanted to convey in my own life. I'm still learning. I'm still growing. No one is perfect. We always can be better Catholics. We always can be better human beings in the world. And so I really, one day at a time, and I'm still learning and growing. And I can't wait for the next book where I share the next chapter of my journey.
Oh, that's beautiful. And I know it is a gift, faith. And for some, it's given very early. So it's great to hear that was your journey. In a very brave way, though, Kate, you outed yourself as a 32-year-old virgin in a Washington Post article 5 years ago to make a really important point that you also make in your book about the beauty of singleness and chastity. What does the church tell us about the single life?
We have a purpose. That's what the church really tells us about the single life. And it can be difficult. We can feel as single people, we can feel lost or alone. We feel like there's no one else out there like us. And especially when it comes to chastity, I think that's what the culture really encourages us to see. And sometimes we even feel that in the church, where we don't feel like we have a community supporting us in the virtuous life, in chastity and other virtues as well. And for me, when I saw that, when I decided to write that Washington Post article, it really stemmed out of seeing two other Washington Post articles that were the complete opposite. People that were saying that chastity and abstinence were archaic. And I really wanted to redefine that. And I saw the gift of single life and the gift of chastity in my own life. I was able to do so many different things that I may not have been able to travel, and seize opportunities in my career, so many different things that dedication to chastity really opened up opportunities in my professional and personal life.
And that singleness really was a gift as well for that season in your life. Why do you think it was important then to write and publish this reflection on women and the church right now in this moment?
In this moment, Montse, I feel like the world is so chaotic. We look at social media. There are so many different things going on in our world. Everything is so dark, right? Every day I feel like we turn on the news and there's so many difficult, dark things that are going on. I'm from Michigan. I live in Michigan. I'm in Miami right now, but we had a tragedy in Oxford last week. And so there are so many heartbreaking things going on, but there are always moments for hope. We see God in so many little things in our lives, in our daily lives, in our daily journeys. And so it's so important to be reminded of that. And in the single life, sometimes we feel like we don't have a purpose or we don't have a voice. And I really wanted to write this book solely for the other individual single women out there, to let them know that they're not alone and that their journey has a purpose, they have a voice, and to encourage other women to share their value and share their dignity and share their purpose with the world.
And Kate, when you think about your book and the impact it's going to have, what is that message then, that one thing you want people to take away?
The one thing that I want people to take away is you have a purpose. You are as unique as your fingerprint. And if you need to be reminded of that, look down at your fingerprint and remember that there has never been anyone like you who has that power to leave that specific imprint on the world. And there will never be anyone like you. So go out there and set the world ablaze.
That's beautiful. Well, you're setting the world ablaze, and I hope that our viewers will pick up your book and enjoy your reflections as much as I did. Thank you so much, Kate.
Thank you, Montse.
And finally, a favorite Advent tradition for Romans and other visitors who come to see the famous 100 Nativities exhibit held every year in St. Peter's Square. Handmade from all types of materials: clay, wood, plastic, shells, paper mache, watch parts, even chocolate. The nativity scenes came from 16 countries this year. Here's a sampling in our Images of the Week. And that does it for this edition of EWTN News in Depth. I'm Montse Alvarado. We'll hope you'll join us again same time next week as we continue our Advent journey with a report about St. Nicholas, the patron saint of children. See you then.